Welcome to the Decision Making Studio podcast. This is a different setup, but you are in town and it's lovely to meet in person. So welcome.
No, it's great to be back, and it's great to be definitely in person and to see you in flesh and have a nice exchange then. So grateful to be on the show.
So this is a lovely book, Disrupt with Impact, Achieve Business Success in an Unpredictable World. We spoke a year and a half ago, I think, so shortly after the pandemic. And this is an interesting and very timely and excellent book. So congratulations.
Thank you.
But what I wanted to start with is what led you to writing it in the first place? Where did the idea come from? What are you trying to achieve with it?
Yeah. So the 2-3 things. I think the first one is, as the Disruptive Futures Institute, we have a lot of content and courses and programs, often directed at B2B, the sort of enterprise market, and often directed at people that are predisposed to some of the ideas for them to kind of consume it. And here I felt, and I've been feeling for some time, that it was important, not just for me commercially, but genuinely important for society, if I can kind of, without wanting to sound pretentious, to have a better handle on some of these topics, and therefore to reduce again the barriers to entry, both in terms of cost, in terms of terminology, language, format. It's a book today, but it's audiobook. It can be something more digestible than a 20-hour executive program. So the one idea is really, it's very relevant to a lot of people, just as a survival for today's complex world. And the second element is I've kind of slightly matured as well a few topics, which I wanted to bring to light in the book, in particular with the word impact. So, understanding nonlinear complex change as in disrupt. The status quo is not really an option for humanity. But with impact is how do you make it effective? How do you drive change? How do you drive transformation, complex systems? So I kind of matured my own journey from capacity building for foresight and uncertainty to effectiveness in driving change. And maybe the third element is one of the words in the title, which is unpredictable. It's always been a focus, and we had one of the most intricate podcast discussions around unpredictability some time ago. So I don't know if I've matured more the idea of unpredictability, but certainly it's more of a dominant feature today than it's ever been. So the number of talks I get asked that are specifically on unpredictability has skyrocketed over the past 6 to 12 months. And so there's really a particular emphasis in my curation in this book around really trying to be as helpful as possible in terms of understanding what that means and the implication for decision making, which is our topic.
This is a really timely conversation. We're just over a week after the results of the US election, and it's one thing after another in the world. And I continue to see and hear people try to describe what's going on in the world in terms of uncertainty, that acronym VUCA, which I get a little bit tired of hearing, but there's this, something is happening in the world that we haven't really gotten to grips with. I have co-written a book on the poly crisis, so all these interconnected things that are coming together. And your book starts with an interesting question, and that is, what's different now? So disruption's always existed. We've always had technological change, but I want to pinpoint what is different now. Why are we, in your view, feeling so challenged by this concept of unpredictability, and what is different now?
Yeah, no, I mean it's one of those paradoxes, and indeed in our complex world we have paradoxes and tensions and surprises and contradictions. And you're right. I mean, disruption in any sense has existed forever. I think it was something like 3,600 BC when we invented the wheel, and that, clearly changed a lot of things, etc. I think I was in Vienna earlier this week. In fact, I flew back this morning from Vienna, and I think that's the town of Joseph Schumpeter. And Joseph Schumpeter, focuses on industrially, institutionally, maybe at a country level, creative disruption, which he kind of coined. And I think that was kind of a way of looking at institutions. A lot of was after the Second World War, which kind of collapse, rebuild, and some form of innovation and progress around that. And then probably for much of the world today, when you use the word disrupt, they think about Silicon Valley, which is, to my mind, quite a narrow, technocentric, specific. It's discrete, it's replicable, it's understandable in terms of disruption relating to technology, products, or innovation. And the most probably known person or terms is around disruptive innovation, and it's Clayton Christensen, very obviously kind of the pioneer of disruptive innovation and his language. And he's illustrates what is disruption in his language or not, and he kind of says, okay, Uber is not disruptive innovation because you're targeting the same clients as a normal taxi. Yes, it's an app, etc. But ultimately, whoever's trying to hail a cab will use Uber, and it's the same target market. He then contrasts that with Netflix and says, okay, Netflix is disruptive innovation because they targeted a sort of marginal, loyal, very savvy, artsy audience, and that built loyalty and eventually had all the products, which is why, for those who are young enough to remember, old enough to remember, Blockbuster's CEO famously said, Netflix isn't even on my radar screen, it's not a competitor. And a few years later, Blockbuster went bust. But the point of this is that, for me, that is disruption 2.0. For me, that is 90 or 95% of the world will see disruption. When I use the language disrupts, we'll think, oh, Clayton Christensen disruption. For me, that's disruption 2.0. And it's a very specific use case, which indeed is more the sort of, it's not new, there's always some kind of innovation or disruption or new product. I think what's new and why we think it's different, and that's what we frame in the book, is disruption 3.0, where it's systemic. Disruption is a constant. You can't necessarily isolate it. It's not discrete. It's not replicable. There aren't specific rules where you can say this is disruption, this isn't. It's really interconnected, surprising. It cascades in different ways. It's not necessarily just negative or positive. It could be either. And it's certainly not just related to technology and innovation or product. So you're suddenly thinking about, to your point, every single day we have elements of surprise. And the less we appreciate that to update disruption, we actually should be thinking of disruption 3.0 of systemic change, we will be surprised. If we appreciate that an updated view of the world is that it's constantly changing and that it will be very surprising and that it's all systemic and that things are very interconnected and related and impact and cascade each other, then maybe we'll be less surprised and we'll be thinking about, well, how do we accept what is our operating system to make decisions and to make sense of that new environment, as opposed to thinking it's surprising. So it's in that sense that we feel there's a change of what change is.
That's so interesting. And I want to talk about that in perhaps a little bit more depth before we dive into decision making, right? Because we have all of this stuff going on, but then why do we continue to struggle with decision making? You have a very interesting chapter on AI, so I want to just put a marker on that. But I want to talk a little bit more about this systemic, this complexity that you describe in the book, and you reference lots of things that really describe the world that we are living in, as opposed to the world that we think we're living in.
Yeah, big distinction.
A big distinction, right? Because a lot of our systems and our governance structures and our education system, our organizations are designed for this linear world, that things are predictable, that we can identify an objective, we can work backwards and then figure out what we need to do today. But if we do that, then, as you say, we'll just continue to be surprised. Why isn't this working? Why has this happened? Why has COVID happened? Why has Trump been reelected? Why had Brexit happened? And the next thing and the next thing. And as you say, it's constant. So we should stop being surprised and start leaning into the world in which we live. I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. And one of the things just to latch on to is this concept of, you mentioned this in the book, deep uncertainty. And we can't probabilize. We can't make certain predictions. What what is wrong with trying to predict, or what are the limitations of prediction? If you could just talk a little bit more about that. You've got some lovely frameworks and things, but just so that we're on the same page around not being surprised and disruption 3.0. I'm curious if you could describe that a little bit more, so we have a full picture of what we're living in.
Yeah, no, that's probably definitely a helpful scene setting. So maybe let me just give 2-3 examples, and then we'll sort of unpack from deep uncertainty to risk and that, and in between. One of the examples I find quite fascinating is when you look at the Fed, and at the time, the head of the Treasury, Yellen, she stood up to the world and sort of said, well, I thought we could control inflation, but hey, I can't really. And I thought that, we thought we knew where inflation would land. We had no idea that we'd have the highest inflation in half a century, and not the only country. And what surprises me with that is that she's surprised, and that she relies exclusively, or the Fed or whatever. They have the best supercomputers. They have the best economists, econometricians, statisticians probably, or amongst the best of the world. And it's really due to the fact that they're relying on the assumption, to your point, of stable, linear, predictable, and controllable. And the cost of relying on that assumption is huge. I mean, first of all, if you're printing money for some time, you might think it could be inflationary. But let's even park that aside to the point of systemic disruption, which is where we want to lead then to decision-making in that context, and analyzing it, is that, when you have the geopolitical events that we saw over the past few years, that leads then to energy security, then to food price increases, then to all kinds of things which are self-reinforcing and cascade and can affect inflation and other things. So in that sense, it's not kind of like, oh, let's drop surprise. It's let's not rely on assumptions of stable, predictable, linear, and controllable world to the exclusion of other possibilities. Let's rather think about how you build resiliency and how you build an appreciation of these broader scenarios. The same way as when Germany relied on its long-term relationship with Russia and thought, okay, the closer I am to Russia, the best it is for my energy security. It can predicate and inform my military strategy and defense budgets. And that assumption, again, you're sort of relying on one specific assumption. And maybe the final example I would give to make it kind of tangible is when you look at Silicon Valley Bank insolvency 2 years ago, whenever it was the second largest US insolvency. And sure, they made 1 or 2 maybe stupid assumptions around interest rates and the valuation of technology stocks. But what's interesting is that you could argue that it's actually disinformation or networks or the warp speed of information that accelerated it. In other words, when Frank Capra wrote the movie or had the movie It's a Wonderful Life some time ago, it was a bank run, but effectively didn't have social media then. And you could even argue that in 2008 with the financial crisis, you didn't have these platforms. So what happens is that when you have a venture capitalist on Sand Hill Road in Menlo Park telling one of the startups, I hope you don't have all your money with Silicon Valley Bank, 10 seconds later, you can have 200 million people that are aware. And so it's in this sense that we need to appreciate how things hyperconnect into immediately. Now, that is kind of framing examples around systemic disruption. To then move to the second layer of your question, which is, what's risk versus uncertainty versus deep uncertainty? It adds another sort of filter to which one can see the world, which is very important to also the work you're doing and the books you've written and continue to focus on decision making. So the consideration is the following. Risk, indeed, you have basically some understanding of the parameters and you can probabilize them. So if you drive at a certain speed, the risk of a certain type of accident, if you smoke X cigarettes per day, the risk of a particular type of cancer or lung cancer, what have you. And that's well understood by the insurance industry, and it's the way a lot of our environments are. When you then move to uncertainty, you're looking at a number of possible outcomes, and you know what those outcomes are. Will China become the number one economy? Will so-and-so, not to name, but become, win the elections or what have you? And Usually there's an answer to those. There's a set of possible future outcomes that we can articulate and understand and might even agree on. And we're just looking to see if you can probabilize a number of those events. And maybe you can't, but you can certainly enumerate them, understand them, and there's an answer to them. Now, deep uncertainty, or what Mervyn King, former governor of the Bank of England, labeled as radical uncertainty, is you have basically, I wouldn't say necessarily an infinite, but a large number of future possibilities. And they can include some of the ones I mentioned under uncertainty, well, so-and-so, this economy become first, etc. But they include things which don't necessarily have a clear-cut answer, and there are a large number of them. What is longevity going to look like? Do you live till 100 or 150 or 80 or 200? Might you work and live and produce in space? I mean, what are the direct, specific implications of some of the potential climate events? For instance, if you think about certain cities being submerged, how bad, how long, at what point in time are we talking about? And of course, any city is bad, but I think a world where, New York, Miami, LA, San Francisco is underwater, just to take the US, it's pretty material. What will be the implications of China fighting with the US? Is that a new world war? Is it, and once you start layering all these things, which can be opportunities too, can you cure diseases? Longevity is an opportunity. Not everything is necessarily negative. But once you put all these together, there's a large number of possible futures, many of which will not find an agreement even amongst experts. So you can't rank them, you can't enumerate them. And even if you could, you won't have an agreement as to how to mitigate or address them for certain of them, just simply because that's the world we're in today, unfortunately. And when you add all that together and consider that you're not even taking into account how they might interact amongst each other, once you start thinking about systemic risk or systemic change and disruption 3.0, where it's no longer discrete or isolated, but you're looking at how they might interact, cascade, reverberate, and move into something else, it's almost irrelevant what the outcomes of a specific possible future is, because even if you had some sense of that, which we don't, you can't probabilize them, you can't enumerate them, you can't put a hierarchy, and you certainly have no idea how they might interact. So that's basically deep uncertainty. And if the state of our world is deeply uncertain, that is very, it's very important that we appreciate that and that we give ourselves the tools, the mental models, to make sense and make decisions in that environment.
Yeah. So disruption 3.0, could you just define that or explain it as well? You've mentioned that.
Yeah.
3.0 versus 2.0. Could you give us a rough definition?
Yeah. So it's basically change in the context of deep uncertainty, where the changes are interacting and interrelated, and you have next order implications for the changes themselves and how they might interact with other things, whereby you can no longer necessarily isolate discrete or specific changes of states. In other words, it's the trouble which, our world is basically good at thinking about, what might inflation be? What might this innovation be? What we're less good at is thinking that a particular change will continue to change, evolve, develop, interact with other events, and that the combination of those will mean that the initial change is unrecognizable, is just probably discontinuous, and probably won't just suddenly become a new steady state, because change is a constant. So it's that idea of not being able to isolate a particular change, the knock-on effects, both positive, negative, etc., around the different possible changes, how they interact, and the fact that you won't gain a point where there's a steady state which becomes a new normal or whatever. So it's the difference, for instance, between, let's say there was a pandemic, and after the pandemic, there was a post-pandemic world, which maybe a few more people work from home, and maybe there were certain things that changed by virtue of having had a pandemic, but effectively you have that new normal, which becomes a steady state, which is just a post-pandemic. Effectively, disruption 3.0, where there is a continuous era where there's no such thing for us as a kind of post-pandemic steady state, because there are other things that are moving, developing, they have other knock-on effects, they continue to change. And it's really that inability to at some point in time have a discrete, understandable, controllable, definable state which is defined by that new change, and that which is why I like the contrast with the 2.0. It's a little bit 2.0, 3.0 is not always helpful, to be honest, but I find it important because when you look at a particular innovation, yes, it has knock-on effects and you can build on new innovations, but fundamentally it's discrete, it's understandable, you can define it, it has a specific features, and that's what that disruption is, and that's very different from systemic change.
Right. So there's all those second, third, fourth order impacts and how they interact. And when you start to, I'm just thinking like a decision tree or a fault tree, they start to go all over, they go haywire, and you can't make much sense of, you can't, as you say, probabilize certain scenarios. And much like we're talking about AI, for example, and the environmental impacts of AI as it becomes more ubiquitous, that will have climate change, more climate change impacts potentially, and we don't know where that might go.
Yeah. So the reason I find that important is because, to the topic that you're interested in, and me too, around decision making, deep uncertainty, is the following: is because if you reached a state which was no longer discontinuous, the fact that there had been a disruption and now you have good visibility and clarity, that would be fine. You then can, but the challenge is that if you're then applying sense making and decision making on the basis of having that new whatever it is, that's the danger. And that's why actually, and in ways the concepts are not new, but I think they're more prevalent for more things. In Zen Buddhism and Eastern philosophy, there's this idea of mujo, transience, where things are constantly evolving. And or Heraclitus, you never put your foot in the water twice because your body has changed and the water has moved. So fundamentally, it's something which in the Western world we don't kind of integrate that much, but isn't new. And I think here the ramifications is very important. And I use a word again, some people could criticize me for inventing these random words, but many actually have acknowledged that they are helpful to illustrate. And it's, the idea of meta trends and mega trends. They kind of, the difference between a trend and a mega trend is something that's meant to be more fundamental. It's a broader family of changes, etc. But the thing about mega trends or meta trends is that fundamentally, one, you're assuming that they're probably continuous to a degree. If not, you wouldn't label them that. So there's this idea that we understand what's happening with whatever theme, and it will probably continue like that. So it can help inform decisions because you can rely on that being a constant. The second thing is that, yes, you might bundle a family of trends to call them a mega trend or meta trend, but you're not necessarily looking at how they might interact with one another. And then you're not necessarily looking at the next order implications, etc. So the term I coined, really the word doesn't matter. It's more to kind of contrast it, is meta-ruptions. In other words, disruptions and meta as a portmanteau word to illustrate that actually be a bit careful, because yes, you could say population, whatever, fine. But, here we're going to potentially reach 10 billion, then go down to 2 billion, what time horizons, and in between have incredible potential existential risks that might mean that, God forbid, that it doesn't happen, but that there's no population if it's the end of humanity, or you might have phenomenal migrations which affect. So the idea of, assume longevity or population growth, well, yes and no. So I think it's more certain directions, but they fundamentally will be more discontinuous than continuous and interact in ways where you can no longer look at those groupings and families, if that's helpful.
Right. So it's not like some sort of to also use a perhaps slightly tired phrase, paradigm shift. So something's shifted, and now we've kind of we understand the new rules of the game. So now we just have to adapt to that. That's no longer that doesn't work anymore because the rules are constantly shifting.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic analogy, and I guess it depends on how broadly you talk about the paradigm shift, right? It's exactly that. It's that there's not enough of a paradigm shift that you can just then rely on the shift. And for the anecdote, some of the meta eruptions we talk about is systemic paradigm shifts. So we add the word systemic, and in it, one of them we consider to be information, complexity, and society. And the idea of putting complexity there is, again, that idea of unpredictability. So it's kind of like, it's great that you mentioned it. It's kind of like, yes, it's a paradigm shift, but maybe it's a systemic paradigm shift, which then brings in some of the things we've mentioned. But you're right. It's not that X has happened. We now have Y, and Y is stabilized.
Right. Yes. Yeah. That's a great way of describing that. And now we've talked about all of this stuff, and I'm thinking listeners are probably wondering, and I like to swear on this program, but holy shit, so what do I do? Right. So how do I, plan for the short term, for the medium term?
Yeah.
How do I make decisions day to day? And I'll start with an idea that we need to move away from a lot of the things that organizations, if we talk about organizational decision making, a lot of things just get in the way, and we need to get back to something very, very basic, and that is decision quality, knowing when I make a good decision. And that is based on how I decide.
Yeah.
And there are a number of things that go into that. But I just need to know if I'm making good decisions. And that starts with things like critical thinking and creativity and some very fundamental things that I think we have forgotten. And in a lot of organizations, and we can maybe get into this a little bit more, because I think with automation and processes, we're taking thinking away.
Yeah.
And that's a problem. But if we get back to, this is what I know, this is my purpose, or roughly what I'm trying to achieve, these are what my values are, how then do I take what I know and make some decisions? And then I can make more decisions later on, but I need to be able to know how and if I'm making good decisions, and we are making good decisions. And for me, a lot of this starts there. And then other things come into play, but we've lost that. If you ask a senior executive or an individual what goes into a good decision, you get lots of different answers, and you'll probably get a lot of head scratching too.
Yeah.
So I'll posit that as maybe a place to start, and maybe we could bring in this idea of AI, because with AI, we're letting machines make decisions. So it's very interesting to throw that into the mix, but maybe start with decision making as a fundamental concept, and then we can throw in some of the other layers that you talk about.
Yeah. No, listen, I love that term you use, and I know these are topics you obviously spend a lot of time on, both advising and writing about, thinking about, around decision making quality, right? I haven't used those kind of language together, and I think there's a lot of things that are interesting there. And there are a few thoughts, I guess, as we move to the sort of what do we do about it, to your point. I think the first thing is, when you use language such as, first principles and all that, the reason it's so important what you're referring to, it comes back to, if we believe that our context and in our environment is deeply uncertain, you basically should not be preconditioned or seek to apply just your experience or what an expert might say or particular playbook, because the whole point is that it might be a novel situation with unknown unknowns. And therefore you need, coming back to Zen Buddhism or Eastern philosophy, you need that shoshin, that beginner's mind, simply because it might be novel, it might be unknown unknowns, it's unpredictable, it's emergent, it's a discovery process, it's evolving. And those features, we'll come back to it when we talk about AI and that, but it's an important distinction, which you know very well, but we'll kind of unpack it maybe for some of our listeners if it's helpful. It's a distinction really between complex and complicated, right? Which different people have different frameworks on, and which is, something that's, I think, is extremely important, because complicated is effectively, you have known unknowns, so you understand the range of right answers, and there is a right answer. And it's linear, and therefore it's predictable. You can establish ex ante, if you take a particular course of action, what the outcomes are.
Yeah.
And that's very good for decision making. It's knowledge driven. It's what a lot of our educational system kind of provides us for as tools. And it's what AI might be good at because it's predictable, understandable, ex ante, etc. And that's to do with, maybe, I don't know, why AI can be helpful with drug discovery platforms. It might be how you send a probe to Mars, how you fix a broken plane. These are not simple. I can't do it, but we understand how they work. They're controllable, replicable, etc. Now, contrast that to some of the language we've been using around deep or radical uncertainty, what we label disruption 3.0, and let's just use the word complex to contrast what we've just described as a complicated state. In complex, it's nonlinear, possibly exponential, discontinuous. So you are not able to predict. They are unknown unknowns. So at a point in time, there may not be a range of answers that are known or that you can rely on experts for. It might be that you get to that subsequently, but that is an emergent process of discovery. And to your point around decision quality, it requires amplifying things that you think are working, maybe dampening things that might not be working, having those diverse perspectives because things are in flux and evolving and they're novel. And that basically means that you may only realize subsequently ex post what you're doing and where it leads you. So if you contrast that to complicated, to summarize, in one case, it's predictable. Complex is unpredictable. In one case, it's linear. The other one is nonlinear. In one case, ex ante, if you do something, what the outcomes are. In the other one, you don't. In one case, you can sort of just make sense of it, use your playbook or your knowledge and apply it. The other one, you really need to sort of probe, see what the hell's happening, and etc. And that might be, for instance, the Amazon. If you build a city or something, how will things evolve from that? There are too many different drivers in flux interacting with each other to know what the impact of that is.
Right.
And so that is very important because when you then come back to what you call decision-making quality, what you mentioned as first principles and that, which are extremely important, basically, if things are complicated, they matter a bit less. It doesn't matter. Maybe AI can find the answer. Maybe you've learned something or you can see a consultant. It's fine. There's a range of right answers. Someone might know, you recognize it, fine. The challenge indeed, where it's survival and you can't rely on AI, and we can unpack that in a moment, is when things are unknown unknowns, when they're unpredictable. There you need the first principles. You need to break down the assumptions. You need to not rely on them and have different modes of sense-making, decision-making. And that requires not only the sort of cognitive decision-making process, but also being humble enough to realize that you may have shocks in the system that you need to build resiliency for and make decisions despite not knowing, and be happy not to know. It's a positive. And I think the biggest danger is when you're seeking to find answers and you're in a complex environment, as opposed to asking yourselves, what are the questions I should be asking myself? So in one mode of complicated, you're really sharpening your pencil. You're trying to do things you know and understand better. And that's what a lot of education is. And then in the other one, it's very different. And so the problematic we're no doubt going to unpack now in the rest of the discussion is in that complex area, how dangerous and problematic is it that you don't recognize that it's different from complicated? What are the differences in terms of tools or frameworks that you should be using? And the dangers of using AI in the wrong environments where, and that I think is a good segue to those topics.
This is really fascinating. And you said the word humble there, because I think as far as leadership goes, we need humility in leadership. We need leaders who recognize this, right? So we need leaders who are able to say, actually, I don't know the answer. There may not be a right answer. We don't have a right answer right now. That's a very difficult thing for a leader to say of an organization. But the irony is that's what we need, because the complex, complicated. I had Professor Dave Snowden on the podcast a few weeks ago, and he talks about this, obviously, because he came up with the Cynefin framework, which talks about this, and said often what you'll get is you're a leader of an organization and you've got maybe 5 different proposals of 5 credible things you could do. They all seem like the right answers. What do you do? And what you should do is run 5 experiments.
Yeah.
And see what happens, because sometimes just by taking action, that's how we will learn in this complex, uncertain environment, right? And that's really interesting, because if we go back to AI is based on data. And I'll throw in another quote here, because I think that will maybe lead us right into an interesting discussion. It comes from Rory Sutherland.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Who wrote this wonderful book called Alchemy, and creative director at Ogilvy. And he says, all data comes from the same place, the past.
Yeah.
So what AI is doing is taking data that comes from the past and is giving us certain answers.
Yeah.
As opposed to looking forward around new data. So if we over-index on AI, we could steer ourselves into some really difficult spots. And I think we need to understand that that's what a lot of these machines are currently doing. But curious what your take is, because you do outline these sort of different levels of AI, 3 levels of AI, and what where all of this might be going. And maybe if we just start with AI and what it is right now, what it is capable of, and maybe where it might be going, and what that all means for decision making.
Yeah. So the real interest for me in AI is indeed, as you kind of indicated, is around decision making. And the real interest in AI for me is actually in humans, what it means for humans and decision making. And so I think the way I see it is, even that machine learning is real time and to a degree emergent and all that, in the end, to Rory Sutherland's quote, or saying it slightly differently, but it's saying the same thing. There's no data on the future. And if you're in that complex domain of unpredictability, the challenge you have is that AI is not good for that, simply because there's no data on the future and it's unpredictable, it's nonlinear. And so what's very important for me is to already make the distinction. You gave a great example of leadership and humility, or the lack of. It's because they think everything is a complicated domain. They don't even understand the distinction. If you appreciate complexity, I'd be more reassured to have a leader acknowledge that she or he appreciates the environment, that actually not knowing is a feature of complexity, because it's unknown unknowns. But of course, unfortunately, we're not in that thing. But coming back, this is a direct link to AI and decision making, because AI is good in being able to run millions or billions of correlations, even unexpected or surprising, where we understand how things happen and they're linear, to a degree, how the body works, or a number of other things. That's why DeepMind is so good, the recent Nobel Prize. That's fine. We kind of have some sense of that. Now, all of that, AI is good, and where it's going, to keep it simple, I like to think about AI and decision-making as a value chain. And I think that for domains that are complicated, anything that can be, cognified, automated, digitized will be, and AI will continue to move up the value chain. Now, of decision-making, from analytics to predictive to prescriptive. And I don't think it's of course, you need to debias and ethics and a lot of considerations. But fundamentally, to use AI as a support for decision-making, for complicated environments, for things that the mind can't process, that are understood, it's not shocking. I can see why one does it, and it's not necessarily the end of the world if you have the right safeguards. What is the end of the world, literally, and you'll see why in a second, is if you're using AI for complex. Why? Very simple and very complex. The biggest challenges for society are things that are complex. It's climate, it's emerging technologies, it's geopolitical, it's societal. And those challenges are not resolved. They're not linear, they're not complicated, they're complex. You therefore need new modes of approaching it. If you're then applying AI as if it were just sort of the human body, or as if it were things we understood, or sending a probe on Mars, it's of no use. The danger is that as we don't make the distinction between the two types of environments, complicated and complex, and as the biggest challenges of society are complex, if you're using AI for that, they're not going to help. And whether we like it or not, it's probable that a lot of civilizations literally go extinct or finish. People like Teuben or others write a lot about what constitutes the end of a Mayan or whatever civilization. And it's often because at that point in time, humanity wasn't able to solve the most complex challenges of its time. And so the danger is, without appreciating what's complex and complicated, without appreciating where AI can be useful, you're delegating decision outcomes to machines that should not be better than humans in making that decisions. By doing that, humans are descaling because we're less capable of, to your point, of first principles, of critical thinking, of making sense of complex environments. So because we're less good at it, we're more likely to delegate decision-making outcomes to machines. In doing so, we are decreasing our capabilities for decision-making and sense-making. So it's kind of like Ricardo for economics. You kind of have machines that are learning fast. And not only are we not learning as fast as machines because we're not upgrading the educational systems, we're not upgrading governance structures or the incentive structures, we are actually descaling because we're actually doing the opposite of learning fast, which is delegating machines. So unless we have a rethink of education, a rethink of governance and incentive structures, which allow us to upgrade our human capabilities of decision-making, there's a real concern there. One or two sort of other elements to put in consideration is that when you're so determined to look for the outcome of what comes out of the model or AI or whatever, you're doing like the Fed did with interest rates. So you're not necessarily building resiliency in the system. Because you think it's predictable, you're predicating your decisions on whatever outcome, etc. So that's where foresight is helpful. You think of different plausible scenarios, you're thinking of next order implications and how things that seem non-intuitive might interact. And you're not trying to predict those, which is exactly what we should avoid. You're trying to be more future prepared, futures intelligent, and you're trying to build resiliency in the systems. And the more you kind of push towards AI in modes which are not helpful, it's that. Final comment maybe is a term I use in the book called Techistentialism, which is effectively taking stock around existentialism with a small e, in a different sense from the philosophers Heidegger or...
Right.
Sorry, a different... Let me take a step back. Yeah. I think today the word existential risk for AI has been hijacked by false dichotomies of utopia or dystopia. In other words, it's easy for Silicon Valley and the media to sort of say, oh, it will save the world, or oh, it's the end of the world. My sense is that, and this is really the topic which interests us both around decision-making, is that existential actually means decision, freedom, agency, and choice. And the existential philosophers, Heidegger and Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, used it in the sense of, you exist and you create your essence. And that's uncertain. It's actually great, because if things were predetermined, you wouldn't have freedom, agency, and choice. And complicated is kind of like predetermined. Complex, actually, it's a good thing that things are unpredictable, but you need to be able to exercise freedom, agency, and choice. And my concern is, in a world today, and I call this Techistential because today existence is existence in a technological world. Humans no longer have exclusivity on decision-making. And therefore, what happens, the Techistential environment, is really what is being human, existing, and decision-making in a technological world. And so the real concern for me is we should be cognizant of this Techistential era and upgrade our human decision-making capabilities, have frameworks which help us do that, and we can talk about some, rethink education for that exact domain where it's a blessing that things are unpredictable, because it means we are able to exercise that agency. And as we push things to AI, it's the opposite that's happening. And so the danger is that machines are becoming more human-like. Humans are becoming more machine-like. And is the risk super intelligence or super stupidity, either because machines can do stupid things, or extreme risk of things collapsing, or systems, or simply humans become super stupid? And There are a lot of different things. I think I should probably pause and let you sort of reorient it.
There's so much good stuff there. A few just thoughts when we talk about geopolitics, for example. Geopolitics relies on human decision makers, world leaders. And in geopolitics, uncertainty is built in because if we knew if China was going to invade Taiwan or do a blockade or whatever, then you could counter it, China could be exploited. Same with the US. And so there is an inherent uncertainty of what the other side is going to do in geopolitics. So that's already one of the key features of the world in which we live. So there's already this inherent uncertainty. AI cannot predict that. And it's a fool's errand to try. What I think is really interesting when I'm thinking about my own use of just generative AI is showing its workings, because sometimes you get an output and you're like, this makes no sense. You actually have to. I remember when my father was doing research for his PhD, and he had to use these mainframe computer things and these punch card things. And one of the things he said was, when you got the output and you could see, you physically had to like handle the data. You physically had to handle these cards and physically had to handle the data, and you could see when something was off. Because the numbers just didn't, something was off. So you could get into the workings. So not just the outcome, but the workings. And so I think AI could be useful provided, and I'm not sure if this is going to be even possible, but provided we understand what's going on and can ask it to show us your workings. Like that's a very interesting question to ask, even just these generative AI models. And kind of develop a little bit of the human machine relationship, but instead we're outsourcing stuff and assuming that we're getting the right answer, and that is the road to this generic, this sort of stupidity that you talk about. So that was one of the reactions. But you talk about the education system, and I'm just wondering if you could share a few thoughts around what needs to change in this space.
No, and I'll do it with a segue to the example we've given, because it's actually very interesting and insightful, the sort of outcome, answer versus question and versus journey to get there, right? And I think, once again, on the sort of complicated perspective, indeed, it's good maybe to have the traceability, the audit, and understand how the machine got there, and there was an answer and it achieved it, and maybe it would have been better or good to come up with it yourself. But at least there's an answer. The real danger for me is when you kind of conflate the outcome with the process of getting there for novel situations for which there may not be an answer. Because, your example of your father with his PhD, or any essay or book you've written, and the work you do, or any of us, is that really what you're learning and discovering is emergent. And it's that journey. And so if you're sort of jumping to the outcome, especially if it's an answer, you're assuming that there is an answer, that it's the right answer, that someone else might know, and that there's and that all the value lies in the answer as opposed to the journey. Which then brings us back to the question around education, because education is not teaching you the answer of a number of things, right? Or shouldn't be exclusively that. There's absolutely nothing wrong with knowledge and understanding things that are history-based and that are knowledge-based, and these are not either-or decisions. But I think the problematic is that there's a whole new area which doesn't have that features, which is what are the questions we should ask ourselves, which is not to be judged basically by how well you're answering a known question, but what are the questions you're asking yourself? How often do you stumble? How often do you pick yourself up? Innovation and failure go hand in hand, as Bezos says. And education really is not that good in emergent, is not that good in critical thinking, is not that good in kind of forgetting knowledge and just looking for questions, for testing, for trying. The 2 or 3 additional points I would make, I think one is to do with specifically information in relation to disinformation and that. And we use the term inforruption in one of our chapters, information disrupted, in terms of how information is used, misused, abused, and understood. And I think in education, from the playground to the boardroom is how I use education, not just educational systems for children, is information should be like a language. It should be something you appreciate the nature of it, the source of it, how it can be used, the nuances, the impacts, the magic, but also the dangers, etc. And I think that is a very important thing for society today, to have a better relationship and a critical appreciation about information. And then the final comment I'd make, and this is maybe not just education for school, but at the end, it applies to school as well. And I'll give you a simple example, which is I'm on the board of a nonprofit by a well-known futurist called Dr. Peter Bishop, which is called Teach the Future. And they basically try and bring futurist thinking to schools of 12 to 18 years old. And it doesn't mean that they're teaching them, PhDs on complexity and systems, but just introducing very easy things to get the mind to think in a broader, longer, more systemic way. And for me, the most important framework, I think, that we bring into our work, which effectively is when I was also asked by the Chamber of Deputies in Brazil, how I think that education should evolve for humans to stay relevant in our complex 21st century, where we live with machines that are running fast. I actually talked about the AAA model, which we talk about, and which has three, I think, simple features. But
please talk about what that is.
Yeah. So basically, the first one is just simply have resilient foundations. So the first A of AAA is anti-fragile. It's the opposite. It's the opposite of fragile. It's coined by Nassim Taleb. So it's not only do you want to be resilient and sustain shocks, but ideally you want to improve, like the willow tree. When it's windy or if there's a fire, it actually improves. And, So the first element is because it's unpredictable, things might happen that are outside of your radar. That's totally normal. It's a feature. It's okay. But you need resiliency, or ideally more anti-fragility. The second thing, which both you and I have touched upon, which is, and it's not just a question of being stakeholder economy versus capitalist versus, it's really just appreciating that the impact of change is not just what happens tomorrow morning. So it's thinking slightly longer term, next order implications, more systemically. And that we use as a second A, which is anticipatory. It's not to predict, but it's to anticipate in the sense that you might think longer term,
right,
and really form views of different possibilities that might evolve.
Things like scenario planning.
Exactly. But that are plausible. So it's not pure science fiction. Everything, is probably plausible. And indeed, it's exactly that. It's for the Fed or the example of Germany, instead of relying on the one assumption of the interest rates or what our relationship with Russia is to just accept the multiplicity of possibilities and think about that. And the idea of that anticipatory is not to predict the outcome or that any of them come right, because it's unpredictable. It's the journey and the agility and the preparation of, two things. One is sustaining shocks and problematics should other scenarios arrive. You're more likely, if you see the world slightly differently and broader, you're going to prepare differently and probably respond differently. So that helps you with that, to have that multiplicity of possibilities that are plausible. The second thing is that you can either actually orient the future, if you're anticipatory, to the vision you have that is your preferred future, if you're more intentional around that. And so that's anti-fragile, anticipatory. And the third A is simply what we call agility, which is used, it's another word which has a million meanings, but we use it in the sense of the agility to reconcile the longer term vision with the decision making today in the here and now, accepting that only the present exists. But instead of sort of saying it's an either or decision, let's not think long term because it's too long and who knows, you accept that the here and now is essential, that only the present exists, and you need that cognitive, emergent, and strategic agility to reconcile your longer term vision with decision making in the here and now. And that basically, the AAA, it gives you the foundations that are more resilient, the way of sort of thinking long term, but informing those longer term anticipatory scenarios and visions, informing them with decision making today and having that agility to emerge in the here and now with decisions. And that for me is, you don't need to label them like that, but fundamentally that's what education should be. You're learning, And that's what we do with the World Economic Forum. I'm part of their Global Foresight Network. Effectively, you're trying to build futures intelligence, future preparedness, and resiliency. So you need the right foundations. You need to think longer term, but you need to be able to reconcile that with short-term decision making day to day.
Right. And if you were to give some advice, let's say to an executive team or a board of let's say it's a large publicly traded company, what would you say? What would you advise them? Because a lot of their incentives are very short term.
Yeah.
So how would you advise an organization to start thinking more about its future and disrupting with impact? Because here, disrupt, that's a verb.
Correct.
As opposed to being disrupted.
Correct.
So what would you advise? How would you, I know this is probably, we don't have enough time to dive into all the details, all the specifics, but what are some of the things that you would tell them to do that they may not be doing now?
No, it's a core part of our work. It's one of the raison d'être of our Disruptive Futures Institute. In fact, earlier this week, I was giving a keynote talk at the Institute of Directors of India for the Global London Conference. And the messages are along some of the themes we have. So number one is to have agency, because agency is like an option. Unless you exercise it, nothing happens. So to have agency. Number two is the awareness, not necessarily in this order, but the awareness of the context of the features of complexity. So when we talk about humility, It's actually not humility to sort of say we don't know. It's actually just simply being aware of our environment. That is one of unpredictability. So to have that awareness and appreciation. Number three, one of the things we didn't talk about is diversity, in the sense, not necessarily of the way it's kind of been a little bit hijacked with certain kind of politicized, but diversity has very important purposes, of course, for society and for gender and for equity and equality and that. But it also has a very important role in that complex environment where you don't know the answer, because you need different perspectives. You simply cannot rely on they are unknown unknowns. So you need, to your point, try different scenarios, have different views, etc. So you need that diversity in the broader sense. You then need to have those, whether it's a AAA or whatever you want to call it, somehow you need to build resiliency. And you need to have some foresight capability for longer term with tools that are kind of more emergent and feedback loops related today. That's something you can learn. There are a million examples of it, whether it's the OODA loops or the Kinnaman frameworks. And these are things that you can build the capabilities in an organization for. And then you touched upon, of course, the key thing, and maybe I should have started with that, which is the incentives, right? And the governance structures. Incentives determine outcomes, so it's extremely important to have the right incentives. But in the end of the day, what I personally feel more and more, and we work a lot around this area, is that sustainable futures and sustainable value creation doesn't mean long term. Because things are unpredictable and asymmetric, both the opportunities and the shocks can arise instantaneously, anytime, and create or wipe out a lot of value creation. So what we try and do is give examples of that, and there are many, so that they realize that this is not a sort of pie in the sky in 10 years, whatever, or trying to do a goody-goody company, that actually there is not a disconnect between staying relevant as a company and sustainable value creation. Because if you're not thinking about these things and building resiliency, your company can disappear any minute, and vice versa. If you're not currently the leader or whatever, you can also be opportunistic, and that's why smaller companies or so. All of these basically are linked to the topics we've touched upon around kind of awareness, around sustainable futures, around systemic risk and opportunities, and the features of exponential, which means they can hit you very fast. It's not just kind of long term, and trying to kind of break that either or distinction between, I have the wrong incentives, it's too long term, because that doesn't mean anything when time is becoming liminal and compressed, where the future is encroaching on the past and the present and vice versa, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. I've been thinking a little bit about time that leaders have to make decisions. And you do talk about the speed of change, and I do agree that is a factor in decision making. But I also think that leaders often have more time available to make big decisions than they think they do. And it's a question of creating that time. And sometimes I think it's perhaps there's no single decision, but maybe it's just carving out the time to think more broadly about some of the topics that you describe.
Yeah. And there's a distinction I make somewhere in the book where we try to make the difference between emergence and emergency. And what I try to kind of unpack is to say, listen, the way you see the world will inform how you prepare. And the way you prepare will then impact how you respond. And the point about that is that, let's just simply take, if you think of broader scenarios, you'll prepare differently, build resiliency, do some of the things we've talked about. And then what you need to respond to is a smaller subset, because you are not going to be caught short by day-to-day firefighting of emergencies. If you're building some of the things you're passionate about and that we've talked about in this podcast around future preparedness and resiliency, you will have fewer emergencies. And by having fewer emergencies, you'll be able to be more, to your point, thoughtful and gain clarity in the emergent here and now. And the challenge is that it's like the kind of, let me save a few $1 billion to waste trillions with the pandemic or something. It's the same thing with time. The more you're trying to save time by not doing some of the things we talked about, in reality, it means that every second you're firefighting emergencies and you have no time for anything, whereas some of them, not all of them are black swans. Black swans is a go-to taxonomy for the things you haven't prepared for. The reality is that many aren't. You'll have fewer emergencies, and you'll be able to gain that clarity and that space for emergence and decision making in the here and now. So it's paradoxical. It's the kind of, which is exactly your point. Said the way you said it, in the end, you have more time, or you can certainly create more time, but not necessarily with the status quo and the business as usual.
Yes, it's a reframing of the types of conversations that we need to have. I'm just conscious of time, but before we wrap up, I was wondering if first of all, before we wrap up, also very quickly, if you can, would you say something different to a world leader, maybe incoming President Trump, not that he would necessarily listen, but any, world leader or leader of a prominent international organization, would that be any different? Would your advice be any different?
I try not to. I try to try and form, I might tailor if there are things that are useful and specific, but I really try and sort of do my best to form a view of what I think makes sense as opposed to what is expected of me or what is fashionable. Which means that some of the topics I've been interested in, or you for that matter, were completely esoteric some years ago, and now they just happen to be more topical. So, I don't speak, fortunately, probably to people like Donald Trump, but I would say that, like a few weeks ago, I was giving a keynote talk to AXA and the leadership team about systemic risk, unpredictability, and the insurance industry. And I had to ask myself, do I actually, with such a savvy audience, refrain from things that might be obvious, or like distinction between risk, uncertainty, deep uncertainty? Do I say something different? Or when I give talks to the Institute of Directors, or, because they, a lot of them can be quite senior, they're running companies. But I kind of found that the reality, unfortunately, is that most organizations, individuals, and countries are not cabled like this. don't necessarily have an appreciation for these topics. If they do, there's nothing offensive in terms of sharing my views around it. It can help them reinforce or their beliefs and the way they're doing things. And if they don't, there's a chance, and it often happens, that the penny drops and that there's a realization of how important it is. And subsequently, they seek to build capacity for updating the ways of managing a company in the context we're describing. So long story short is no, I think that my effort is on gaining clarity, which I try to have for myself. Whether people agree that it's clear for them is another matter. That's their prerogative. And then doing my best to have a multiplier effect in what I think are important topics. And then if people disagree, don't like it, or think it's useless, that's everybody's prerogative to receive them like that.
Wonderful. I think that we've covered so much really interesting ground. There's perhaps more. I feel like I could talk to you for hours, but we don't have hours, but maybe we could have you back at some point as well to follow up on some of these things. But was there anything that you wanted to mention that you didn't get a chance to, you don't think we adequately covered?
No, I mean, listen, you're right. These topics, whether it's my views or yours, because you also spend, so much time on all these topics, I'd also love to exchange notes more fully. I think one can spend a lot of time and they warrant a lot of time. But I think this has been, I'm very grateful to continue the dialogue, Ben, and I hope some of the concepts are helpful. And like you, I'm always available if anybody thinks it's worth, reaching out or what have you. So nothing specific that I feel is a gap, but thanks for asking.
No, great. I really like the book. It compresses so many things where it's a very rich book, and it has lots of practical stuff in it, especially the last section. I would encourage all my listeners to pick up a copy, which I presume is available wherever books are sold. Or what are the best ways to get a copy and follow
it is. No, it is. Unfortunately, a lot is Amazon in today's world. But I've seen it in Waterstones and some of the other bookstores I like in London, and it's available on most platforms, and it's been sold in over 30 or 40 countries in English for now, but it's really available. And what I would say is, if listeners are interested in learning a bit more without buying it, the website disruptwithimpact.com. disruptwithimpact.com has reviews, interviews, media, articles, videos, if they just want a sort of synopsis of each chapter and section, if they're just curious about it, even just more generally. We try and share a lot of these ideas on social media and in all kinds of form, and we're not just looking to sell books or courses. Fantastic. Roger, thank you for spending some time with me. This was great. Very interesting conversation. Congratulations again on the book, but thank you for spending some time. No, it's such a pleasure, and I'm really, really chuffed that we're in person. Oh, that's lovely. And that it's a human contact in the end. That's really valuable. Thanks so much, Ben. Thank you.